It's the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now, and much of the world has forgotten it. With the war in Sudan now in its 4th year, we look at what's fueling the conflict and why more isn't being done to end it. I'm Hazem Sika, and today's newsmaker is the Sudan Civil War. More than 150,000 people have been killed since the fighting began. Over 12 million people have fled their homes. After more than 3 years of war in Sudan, the army continues to battle with the Rapid Support Forces, the group it was trying to integrate into its own military before the war broke out. Now, as the drone conflict intensifies, we examine the war the world is failing to confront. Here's a look.
Sudan, a country that has faced decades of instability, is now trapped in a conflict that has reshaped everything: its cities, its society, and its future. Since April 2023, fighting between Sudan's army and the Rapid Support Forces has devastated the country. What began as a power struggle in Khartoum has evolved into one of the world's worst humanitarian catastrophes. The country is now fragmented. The army holds parts of the north and east, while the RSF dominates much of Darfur and large areas of Kordofan. Cities have changed hands through siege, street battles, and aerial warfare. More than 14 million people have been forced from their homes. Many families now live in overcrowded camps or have fled across borders. As displacement reaches levels the United Nations calls the largest crisis of its kind in the world. But displacement is just part of the story. Sudan's basic systems are collapsing. Nearly half of the country's health facilities are no longer functioning. Millions lack clean water and sanitation. Disease spreads where medicine cannot reach. Nearly 20 million people face acute food insecurity. Children are among the worst affected. Hundreds of thousands are suffering severe acute malnutrition. Their survival dependent on aid that is increasingly unable to arrive. The war on Iran poses a new threat to harvests in the hunger-stricken country.
Anything that has to do with agriculture, it has impacted. Even the bread that we eat is affected by it. There is nothing. Gas was 22 cents. I bought a can a week ago, and now I am hearing it is 24 cents. Now I am just wondering how I will get it. How will I work? How will I do? The market is the same, but there are no profits. We can produce, but there are no profits.
But the nature of this war has changed again, turning into a drone conflict. Unmanned aerial vehicles have become the deadliest weapons on the battlefield. Between January and April, hundreds of civilians were killed in drone strikes, accounting for the majority of conflict-related deaths in that period. Markets, hospitals, villages, and mosques have all been hit. Human rights organisations describe torture, sexual violence, and widespread atrocities against civilians. Aid workers and doctors have become targets, and many of them have fled the country, while others have been killed for trying to document the ongoing situation. The United Nations warns this is not just a conflict. It is a humanitarian disaster happening before the world's eyes.
The conflict has ravaged livelihoods, uprooted communities, and driven millions of people into hunger. Famine still stalks parts of this country. Aid workers, trucks, and warehouses continue to come under attack, putting the lives of our colleagues at risk and disrupting our assistance.
And yet, despite the scale of destruction, the crisis remains under-recognized globally. As diplomacy stalls and ceasefires collapse, Sudan slips further into fragmentation, starvation, and technological warfare. A country once fighting for democracy now struggles simply to survive.
Well, joining me now to talk more about this from New York, Professor at Syracuse University, Jok Madut Jok. From Berlin, we have Founding Director at Confidence Advisory, Kholood Khair, and from Cardiff, Conflict Analyst Elbashir Idris. Thank you very much for being with us. Let me start with you, Jok. More than 3 years into this war now, How would you assess the current state of the conflict and the balance of power in Sudan?
Yes, thank you for having me. At the moment, the Sudan Armed Forces, essentially the National Army, has regained control of a lot of places, especially in the center, including the capital, Khartoum. And in a sense, you can say that some semblance of life has returned to Khartoum. The RSF, the Rapid Support Force, the contending force, is now in control of more of the West, Darfur and Kordofan, including areas bordering South Sudan, while Sudan government, the army, controls areas closer to its borders with Ethiopia and much of the north. So there is now a situation where there is a sense of equality between the two sides in terms of how much of the country each one of them controls, suggesting that this war is not likely to be won by any side anytime soon, especially with regards to foreign assistance to each side. One would have thought that the current war in Iran and Lebanon would have reduced the amount of support from the Middle East to the government of Sudan or to the RSF. But the Iran's war doesn't seem to have affected the balance of power currently in Sudan. But it's entering its fourth year rather, which means that, as was predicted, these wars are not easily winnable by any side. And the consequence is that a lot of civilians suffer, as it is now showing in the humanitarian situation.
Kholood Khair, what in your view is fueling this war? And if neither side is able to secure a decisive victory, what's keeping it going?
Well, this war works sort of at different levels, at various levels and fractals. What you have is a very real personal enmity between the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces and the head of the Rapid Support Forces. But you also have effectively two competing institutions that are fighting a war of succession in order to be able to inherit fully Bashir's security military state. Bashir, of course, being the dictator who stayed in power for 30 years until he was removed through popular revolution in 2019. And the leaders of the SAF and the RSF have really worked very hard to try and get as many allied groups and militias to work with them and effectively metastasizing this conflict across the country. But there's also a regional element to this, which is that, you have countries like Egypt and Ethiopia who are currently in contention over, for example, the Nile waters, as well as other files, and Eritrea as well, who's joining the fray. And they are aligning themselves with the security actors that they find in Sudan, which would be able to guarantee some of the political outcomes that they want to see. So we see Egypt backing the Sudanese Armed Forces, a position it has maintained for decades, and we see Ethiopia continuously being implicated in its support to the RSF, especially in granting them access to some of their sort of military sites close to the Sudanese border. But we also see, and I think what is often missing, a local and hyper-local element to this conflict that is really informing the level of violence we're seeing at the local level. It's informing the level of recruitment that we're seeing in on both sides. It's informing the level of the ability of SAF and the RSF primarily, but not exclusively, to be able to access constituencies across the country. There's a reason that, the foreign money, the foreign weapons, chiefly from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia backing the Sudanese Armed Forces, the United Arab Emirates backing the RSF, is able to find traction in the way that it has, because that money is able to purchase effectively recruitment, is able to purchase loyalties, is able to purchase the means effectively to keep this war going, to keep violence as the main way that this war is being fought. But of course, this was also being fought at the mediation table. We've seen that throughout the past 3 years. We've also seen this war being fought in the information space, particularly on social media.
All right, let's put some of that then to Elbashir. What's your assessment of this, and how significant as well is, in your view, this role of the foreign actors sustaining the conflict through arms, through money and political backing?
Well, this conflict in Sudan certainly has its architecture within the region, and with regional players essentially fueling this through the continued delivery and trafficking of arms within Sudan, even though there is a historical UN arms embargo by the UN Security Council for these matters of related to war. However, within this 2026, within now the fourth year of the war in Sudan, though some elements may seem that the war has calmed down, it may in fact has taken a much more lethal turn with the rise of drone warfare, essentially from both sides, with SAF and the RSF. Though people may see on social media and online essentially Sudanese civilians returning to Sudan, or maybe returning to the capital in Khartoum, which is under control by the Sudanese Armed Forces, that does not mean they are going back with hands raised in the sky in victory, but more so in necessity, as they have been facing persecution and threats as refugees and migrants in neighboring nations. And as such, many Sudanese migrants have been going back to Sudan, but without those basic government services and public services that are there in many places. In majority, electricity still hasn't returned, nor has water, nor is the supply of food or any other supplies from charities and INGOs and NGOs. So essentially, it is controlled by the government and the humanitarian organization of the government. As such, it doesn't seem like this war is going to end anytime soon. It's become a stalemate of technology and money, with the proxy forces of Saudi Arabia and Egypt supporting SAF amongst many, and the UAE and Ethiopia amongst other neighbors supporting the RSF. And so this isn't a conflict that's going to end up with shaking hands tomorrow, but also it's very much exacerbated by the increase in warfare and even in civil unrest. This is a war between two sides who once have enjoyed the privileges of impunity together, and unfortunately we're seeing that impunity demonstrated again by the Sudanese Armed Forces by trying to take and reach out to commanders of the Rapid Support Forces to essentially turn and switch over to the side of the army. However, a lot of questions are raised in terms of the moral elasticity, you can say, of this plan of bringing those who have committed those same grievous and horrendous and brutal human rights atrocities, and yet bringing them back into the fold of the army without any repercussions or impunity. So clearly we have a lot of way to go before we see an war.
Yeah, you cover a lot of things there, Elbashir. I want to come back to the human rights issue in a moment, but I just want to focus a little bit more on the humanitarian situation. As we said, it's the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Kholood Khair, just give us a sense of what that means in practical terms for ordinary Sudanese civilians.
Well, we've seen reasonably consistent rates of sort of humanitarian indicators that show a very appalling picture. We've seen consistently around the 19 million child mark of children out of school. We've seen 70 to 80% of health centers out of commission, and that's hospitals and clinics and all sorts of health centers. We have seen that Sudan has the largest proportion of people that are in need of humanitarian aid, roughly about 50% of people, and that has risen. We have seen that today Sudan is the world's largest humanitarian crisis, yes, but also the world's largest hunger crisis by scale, the world's largest displacement crisis, and also the world's largest sexual violence crisis. That is a very noxious mix of really the worst kind of indicators we have seen, and potentially, given the famine indications that we have today, this could be the worst famine that we've seen, not just in Sudan, but in Africa, and some also posit maybe globally, for about 100 years. Now, this, of course, will be exacerbated by the impact of the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, particularly because fertilizer, fuel, key factors in the agricultural season that started a month ago, will be needed to secure this month's harvest come September, October. And if this year's harvest, and if this year's harvest fails, just like other harvests have done since the beginning of the war, then we're going to see a cumulative effect on famine rates.
Jok Madut Jok, why has the international response to this struggle to match the scale of the suffering? Why hasn't there been a bigger response from the international community on this?
Well, I think the primary reason for a rather lackluster response is the competing disasters around the world, especially those competing for the lights, for the media coverage, like the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, the Israeli war in Gaza, the US war in Iran, have all taken the light, if you wish, but also have contributed to the reduction in some of the funding that used to come from the United States, especially what is known as emergency Chapter 2 emergency program, which is particularly to purchase food to those 19 to 20 million people who are in dire need. So it is not really that there is no humanitarian response. It is that it's extremely hard in terms of financing it, but also in terms of the infrastructure to take the food around the country, including the obstruction of access to some of the most affected areas, like in Darfur and Kordofan, but also to other areas of the country. So it is a combination of these things: lack of funding, lack of access, destruction of infrastructure, and so the onus has now fell squarely on the necks of Sudanese themselves to try to take care of themselves, which they are doing a lot of. But the scale of the problem is just momentous, and so going forward, I think what is it going to take? Is it campaigns to increase international intervention? Surely that. But it is also going to take the warring parties, the leaders of the two contending armies, to prioritize the welfare of their people as well in terms of allowing access to them.
Let's come back then to the human rights situation, which I know you touched on earlier, Elbashir. So I want to come back to that. Both sides have been accused of serious human rights violations. How, excuse me, how extensive are these abuses, and who's, if anyone, is being held accountable?
That's the main question of sovereignty when it comes to the matters of Sudan, especially in terms of who is the one delivering justice and is able to deliver justice on behalf of the Sudanese people, not the Sudanese state nor government. And that is the reason why many see and view Sudan's human rights violations and issues as perhaps the most deplorable, with a mountain of evidence that would suggest that would show. However, when it comes to the severity of these crimes within the past 4 years, though there has been a much more brutal pattern seen with one belligerent more than the other, and as such, those who are seen without the luxury nor privilege to choose a side and are forced to essentially have a stake within the side of the belligerents may see the Sudanese Armed Forces as a much more favorable partner to support rather than the Rapid Support Forces. However, we must understand the history of how it got to this point, how even the RSF believes it can operate in such a manner of impunity, and it's essentially come from the culture that was essentially alive and well within the Sudanese Armed Forces, and that's essentially carried over. So regardless of whether this side or that side wins, the culture of impunity and the lack of human rights awareness and safeguarding and the deliberate, it seems, violations towards it certainly needs to be discussed and handled, not just as between the belligerent sides, but certainly as a society and as a culture. If we are to stop seeing this culture of impunity going forward. Though in terms of the catastrophes, it wasn't. It was just 8 months ago, or less than 8 months ago, we've seen the catastrophe that has happened in Elbashir, where dead bodies could be seen from space and pools of blood as well. And so this isn't a far gone mind that's happened in the past. This is very still recent and fresh. And drone strikes as well, along with the tactic of doing double taps on civilian populations and then emergency healthcare workers and service workers coming in, essentially trying to decimate what's left of any infrastructure within Sudan, may that be in a physical building or even represented by a volunteer on the ground just wanting to see their neighbor be safe.
Kholood, what's your view on this? And I want to ask you as well about the significance of the recent efforts to pursue war crimes against some RSF members. Have victims been, and whether the chance of victims getting justice for this?
Well, I mean, the prospect for justice in Sudan, unfortunately, has been historically very low. We have not seen, any of the state authority in Sudan, and today neither the SAF nor the RSF prioritize justice for obvious reasons. They have been the largest perpetrators of crimes against civilians historically. But there are sort of elements of international justice that could possibly be brought to bear. The ICC, for example, in September of 2024, hinted that it was ready to bring about indictments against the RSF for atrocities committed particularly in Jinena, the capital of West Darfur, and Ardamata, another town in West Darfur. We're still sort of waiting almost 2 years later, and we haven't seen any progress on that. The United Nations fact-finding mission concluded after the very brutal atrocities that to many also constitute genocide in Al-Fashir that Elbashir also just mentioned, released a report that said that those atrocities bear the hallmarks of genocide, but there has been no legal proceedings to adjudicate whether indeed they constitute genocide. What we do know is that a culture of impunity that has lasted for decades has been very much contributed to why we are where we are today. If the SAF and the RSF had face justice for the genocide they committed together in Darfur 20 years ago, we may have been able to raise the cost of warfare and frankly, the abject level of atrocities that we're seeing today. Instead, in the absence of any kind of justice, national or international, effectively, SAF, the RSF, and their allied militias have carte blanche to commit whatever crimes they see fit, knowing really that they won't face any kind of justice. There is just a small caveat to say that the ICC had brought a case against Ali Abdurrahman, also known as Ali Khoshaib, which concluded last year, where he was sentenced for crimes against humanity and war crimes in Darfur. Now, he's one of only 5 indictees, including former President Omar al-Bashir, who's currently being protected by the Sudanese Armed Forces, that have ever faced justice. And that was 20 years too late for some people. But at least we saw some kind of progress. At least some of his victims were able to get some kind of respite. We also need to see moving forward, not just regular forms of justice, punitive justice. We also need to see restorative justice. People need to feel that their lives can go back to some kind of normal, but also that they can, get healthcare, can get education, can get access to equal citizenship, and that they can live as citizens in dignity in their country. But that seems like a very far away prospect today.
Okay, so just briefly looking forward then, and I'm going to give the last word on with the minute we've got left to you, Jok. How do you see this playing out? Is there any reason for optimism at all?
Well, in terms of a cessation of the war, that doesn't appear to be any optimism at the moment. But in terms of accountability for the horrendous acts that have been committed, I think it is not going to be a matter of evidence or intent as other wars have struggled with. The RSF particularly has this bizarre practice of committing horrendous atrocities and filming themselves while doing it. So I say that the whole world has watched their own actions because of their own filming. And so there is not going to be a question of evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity, or even the crime of all crimes, the genocide practices, the genocidal practices of the RSF. The most important challenge is going to be the will coming from the international community to push for not just condemnation as usual, not just in indictments on paper, but a commitment to implementing it by making it difficult for the leaders of RSF and SAF to travel in foreign countries. Currently, Hameti has traveled to other countries, and in East Africa particularly, but no questions have been raised about what is essentially a disastrous situation that they have created in Darfur, particularly in Elbashir and other towns.
We'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for your time, all three of you, and thanks for watching. Remember, you can follow us on social media and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Hazem Sika. We'll see you next time.